We are in Mark chapter 7 tonight. Finished up Mark chapter 6 last week. Oh, that's weird. Turn the volume down. Okay. Well. There we go. So, Mark chapter 6, Jesus is, remind me later. Jesus is rejected at Nazareth by the people that he grew up with. They're not interested at all in what he has to say, so he kind of pulls back. He sends his disciples out. They go out on a fairly successful, at least as far as they're concerned, mission trip. They come back. Jesus hears about the death of John the Baptist, and so they pull away so that they can get some rest to get off by themselves. They go over to the kind of the northwest corner of the Sea of Galilee, where they are followed by mobs of people. He feeds the 5,000 and then sends the disciples back, supposed to go back all the way to Bethsaida, but there's a storm that blows them back the other way. And so he walks on the water to them. He helps them out. They land at Gennesaret, and he does some healing and some teaching there. After that, he must go back to Capernaum, because that's where the Pharisees end up coming and finding him. And so that brings us then to Mark chapter 7. And so I'm going to read the story, and then we're going to watch a little clip from The Chosen that shows kind of, with these Jesus movies, what they have to do a lot of the time is kind of take a whole bunch of different stories and kind of put them all together in one scene, so that for economy of time or whatever, so that they can actually get it done. And so the scene that we're going to watch from The Chosen is not exactly and only the scene from Mark chapter 7, but it'll give you an idea of what's going on. So one day, some Pharisees and teachers of religious law arrived from Jerusalem to see Jesus. All right, what is going on there? They noticed that some of his disciples failed to follow the Jewish ritual of hand washing before eating. The Jews, especially the Pharisees, do not eat until they have poured water over their cupped hands, as required by the ancient traditions. Similarly, they don't eat anything from the market until they immerse their hands in water. But this is but one of many traditions they have clung to, such as their ceremonial washing of cups, pitchers, and kettles. So the Pharisees, and that's what it's doing. I had my thing reading the passage to me, and I didn't even know it, and so it kept skipping down. All right. So the Pharisees and teachers of religious law asked him, "Why don't your disciples follow our age-old tradition? They eat without first performing the hand-washing ceremony." Jesus replied, "You hypocrites, Isaiah was right when he prophesied about you, for he wrote, 'These people honor me with their lips, but their hearts are far from me. Their worship is a farce, for they teach man-made ideas as commands from God. For you ignore God's law and substitute your own tradition.' Then he said, 'You skillfully sidestep God's law in order to hold on to your own tradition. For instance, Moses gave you this law from God: honor your father and mother, and anyone who speaks disrespectfully of father or mother must be put to death. But you say it is all right for people to say to their parents, "Sorry, I can't help you, for I have vowed to give to God what I would have given to you." In this way, you let them disregard their needy parents, and so you cancel the word of God in order to hand down your own traditions. And this is only one example among many." Then Jesus called to the crowd to come and hear. "All of you listen," he said, "and try to understand. It's not what goes into your body that defiles you. You are defiled by what comes from your heart." So, let's watch the clip. Oh, yeah, let's go back. the the setting, like the Chosen does as good a job as I know of any at showing you the cultural context, what actually kind of happened with all these things. Where they're sitting, they're eating in Matthew's house, the tax collector, but they're kind of down close to the ground and it's all spread out. This is almost assuredly exactly what the Last Supper would have looked like.
I don't know if he's telling you about it, you know. He was teaching.
The way he ran from the Red Quarter, nearly tripping on his robes.
A Pharisee running? Somehow I can't see that.
I thought for certain he would trip and fall and I would be arrested.
Knowing your luck, Rivka, probably would happen, huh?
I thought for certain Lil was gone forever that day.
And it's Mary now.
Always was.
He was teaching.
Does anyone want any grapes? Barnaby, you eat a lot.
Very observant, Matthew.
Thank you. Simon?
You know, Matthew, when you're not behind iron bars, you're quite handsome.
I agree.
What is going on?
May I help you?
We were just on a walk and we heard voices, and I thought they sounded like... But surely not.
And yet it is you.
Would you like to come in?
We would never, never be caught dead in a...
In a what? In a tax collector's house?
Not only that, but with a... Do you know what she... and he... They are...
You seem to be having troubles finding your words, man.
Why does your master eat with tax collectors and sinners?
There's not the healthy who need a doctor, but the sick.
I must say, I am shocked. She is from the Red Quarter. Much of what is done there cannot even be spoken by my tongue or cross my lips. It is so unholy. The mere mention of it would defile me.
Sounds like a personal problem.
But him and the others he works with, they betray our people for money, and they're not even sorry.
If you're so offended, then leave.
Let them speak, Andrew.
They've never offered guilt sacrifices in the temple.
What? The priest keeps records. We check them. Tax collectors are not welcome at the temple.
Would like them better if they made the proper sacrifices.
This is not about me. This is about what God wants.
You're forgetting the scroll of Hosea. Go and learn what this means. I desire mercy, more than sacrifice.
There are righteous men on the lookout for you, and they are weighing every word you say.
Is that a threat? Please let them know this, Yusuf. I have not come to call the righteous, but sinners.
Is everything under control here?
Yes. We were just going on our way, Centurion.
As Premier Ordina to you.
Prime ordine.
All right, so like I said, it's kind of a conglomeration of a whole bunch of different moments from the life of Jesus, and they don't really get into this whole concept of the age-old traditions and how they wash their hands and how Jesus says it's not what a man puts into his mouth that defiles him, it's what comes out. But this is just the clip that we just watched. That's just another one of those things. It's like there are basically two areas that Jesus attacks from, or defends from. Attacks is probably a pretty good word when it comes to this Pharisees. And that is kind of the purification rituals that he ignores, and then the people that he embraces. And it's like those two things kind of go hand in hand for Jesus, and he uses the one to shine light on the other, if that makes sense. But in this particular case, in Mark chapter 7, this hand washing ritual that they're talking about here, what do you think they're getting at? What do you think they're talking about? What do you think that's what's their hand washing ritual? Anybody know?
Are these the hand washing rituals that they talk about in like Leviticus?
Mm-hmm.
The old Jewish traditions.
Uh-huh. Yeah, and interesting thing, to me at least, is that the Levitical hand-washing purification rituals were for the priests, not for everyday people. And so all of these ways and methods of washing your hands and doing all this stuff, that was for the Levites before they would go into the tabernacle to serve God. The Pharisees had brought that forward here to be, this is what every good Jew needs to do. And the reason was because when we talked about the Essenes and how they pulled away from Jerusalem because they felt like the temple had been defiled, and so they felt like if they could purify themselves and create a little community, they'd create their own little mini temple out in the wilderness, and they would be so full of repentance and purification that it would bring the Messiah, because the temple in Jerusalem wasn't going to do it. The Pharisees had a very similar idea, but instead of pulling out of Jerusalem, they just pulled away from the temple and said, we'll create many temples in our homes. And so they then followed every ritual that you find in Leviticus regarding purification when they would go into their home, before they would eat, before they would do anything. And when we were in Israel, it was really interesting. The Jews would drink out of stone cups and have stone plates and bowls and all this stuff like that, because stone could not be permanently made unclean. You could cleanse stone. If a Gentile touched stone, it was unclean, but you could purify it. Clay and pottery and stuff like that, if a Gentile touched something of yours that was pottery or clay, it's just get rid of it and move on, because there was nothing you could do. And so because of that, there's all this archaeological stuff that you find of the Jews eating, the stuff they ate with and drank from and stuff. So
So I know in the flip they mentioned the sacrifices. Did the Pharisees at that time still do the same sacrifices and all those rituals still?
It would depend on the Pharisee. And so the Pharisees, there were like at least 5, maybe 6 different schools of Pharisees. Just like there's different denominations of churches, there were denominations of Pharisees. And they would have fights over how serious you had to be about the cleansing rituals. They would have fights about how serious you had to be about, everything. It's like in America right now, we are incredibly polarized. And a lot of times I'll hear people saying like, it's never been this bad. It's like, oh yeah, it has. It is, it's like, I had one friend that like basically like he wrote this entire post about, basically saying those people are doing this and those people are doing that, and it's just horrible, and it's just getting worse and worse, and we're just going to flush down the toilet, and I was like, sounds like a synopsis of the book of Ecclesiastes. And he's like, really? And I'm like, yeah, go read Ecclesiastes, and you will hear, why is it that the good are trampled under and the evil prosper? And why don't people see things the way that I see things? Can't they see that this is the way that it's supposed to be? And it's like, and basically you hear everybody's Facebook post, depending, it doesn't matter which end of the continuum they're on, they both say the same things about, can't the other people see how right I am? And it's like they were having that experience in yeah. He was like, when was the book of Ecclesiastes written? I was like, about 2,900 years ago. And he's like, it's like, yeah, that's depressing, but it should also give you hope that it's like, there have been times in our lives where we felt like things were going pretty well, probably, you know. I have a feeling we will get there again, you know. It's like, it's just, we you know, I mean, Solomon said in Ecclesiastes, nothing new under the sun, nothing. And so, so depending on how conservative the Pharisees were, would depend on whether they would even go to the temple. And so Rabbi Shammai was the most conservative and rigid of the Pharisaical schools, I guess you'd say. And he and his followers would never even go to the temple. And but the further you get away from Rabbi Shammai, you know, kind of down that continuum, which probably includes, as you get further away, Nicodemus, and there's a guy named Simon who's a Pharisee that invites Jesus over to his house for dinner, even after Jesus did some weird stuff like this, you know. And, you know, the Shammai Pharisees would have been like, okay, yeah, they would have written him off for good. But like, you know, you hear Nicodemus when he comes, he's like, everybody knows God is with you. Nobody can do what you do unless God's with you. So what's going on? Because, you know, it's like you're not at all what we expected. And Jesus and Nicodemus have this whole conversation. And it must have done something for Nicodemus, because at the end, Nicodemus is there again. You know, he's one of the ones that takes down Jesus' body and buries it and all that. But so, yeah, it depends on the Pharisee. And that's one of the things that Jesus gets on them about. As a matter of fact, I think he says it here. Yeah, when they say in verse 5, the Pharisees ask, even the Pharisees say it, why don't your disciples follow our age-old tradition, right? And by this time, they had been doing this, the Pharisees, for, 100 years or something like that, probably, maybe a little less than that. And so, you think about America right now, if something has been happening for 100 years, it's pretty steeped into the culture. You start talking about the Holy Land and how long all that, how much time there is involved there, and you think 100 years, that's nothing, but it would have totally infiltrated their society. And so any Orthodox Jewish man and family would have just been, they would have done their best to follow these rules as far as they thought they should be being followed, And that's what Jesus and all of his disciples are. They are Orthodox Jews. And that was one thing that they kept drilling into us in the Holy Land. You can't understand Jesus fully unless you understand what Orthodox Judaism was like in the first century. And as you start to understand more and more what Orthodox Judaism was like in the first century, then suddenly the things Jesus says and does suddenly start to kind of come to light. And you're like, whoa, that makes so much more sense. So, okay. So, in verse 6, they ask him, why don't you follow our age-old tradition? He says, you hypocrites, which cues me into the fact that these are Shammai Pharisees here, right? Because not all Pharisees did Jesus consider to be hypocrites. But these guys, when they come at him, with one of these things, they usually get this word right back, hypocrites. And hypocrites was not a word that was a bad word in the first century. It was a Greek word that they used for actors. It's like if you were in a play and you were, one of the cast members in a play, you were a hypocrite. That's the Greek word for actor. Jesus is the first one to take it and apply it to religious people who say one thing and do another. And so they probably were like, it's like he says, you actors. It's like they wouldn't have automatically been like, oh, you called me a bad word, right? He's just like, you guys are actors. And it would have taken them a while to think that through and be like, that was that was a diss. That was a put down. Yeah, I think that was a put down. So you hypocrites, Isaiah was right when he prophesied about you, for he wrote, "These people honor me with their lips, but their hearts are far from me. Their worship is a farce, for they teach man-made ideas as commands from God." So what do you think Jesus is saying? What does he mean by that? Why? In what way do they honor God with their lips, but their hearts aren't in it? Their hearts aren't there. In what way is their worship a farce? Had somebody pipe in here and say, because their hearts aren't following the law of God. And so, yeah, that's kind of what's going on. And another one of the interactions that he has with the Pharisees over these things, they're mad at him because he is breaking the Sabbath law, right? And the Sabbath law, they had, it's like it's just the fourth commandment. The fourth commandment is the seventh day is a day of rest. No work on the Sabbath. You rest and you honor God on that day. And that's basically what it says. And so over the several thousand years between the Ten Commandments being given and the first century when Jesus comes, there's this movement by Orthodox Jews to try to figure out, okay, so how do I know that I'm not breaking that law? I imagine it was a very heartfelt and sincere thing that they were hoping to do. They wanted to make sure that they didn't break the rule. And so they would, in Tiberias, which is on the Sea of Galilee, it kind of started in Babylon while they were in exile, but when they came back, there was this huge contingent of Jews, powerful Jews, that stayed in Babylon. They didn't leave. But a lot of them, when they came back to the Holy Land, they gathered in Tiberias, and there was it's like a seminar, I guess you might call it. I mean, I don't know what you would call it. It was at this one very powerful Pharisee's house, and people would come, Jews would come from all over the world, and you would walk into this guy's courtyard, and there would be anywhere between 5 and 100 Jewish men sitting around discussing, okay, what does this law mean? And they finally write it all out in the Talmud and the Mishnah, and you can read it now. It's like, and basically so they'd be sitting around going, I saw somebody the other day, it's like I'm trying to think of what would have been something new in the first century. But like, imagine that somebody created the bike, right? I mean, I don't think there were probably bikes in the first century, but just imagine that, right? I saw somebody on a two-wheeled mechanical thing, and they were riding it on the Sabbath. Is that okay? And they would sit there and argue about whether that's okay to ride a bike on a Sabbath. And if it was okay to even ride the bike on the Sabbath, could you pedal? Like if you were going down a hill, but you didn't pedal, is that okay? Well, yeah, you're not doing anything. The hill is the thing that's providing all of the work there. And so there's no work being done. So if you don't pedal, or they might say, yes, you can pedal 50 revolutions, but 51, you've broken the law. And so they had all kinds of those things. They sat down and said, okay, how far can you walk on the Sabbath? Because legs had been invented by then. And so they were like, how far can you walk? And they came up with this number. I think it was like 2,000 paces or something like that. It was a couple of miles that you were allowed to walk from your home on the Sabbath. That's how far away from your house you could get. And there were Pharisees that figured out if, like, a Pharisee wanted to go farther than he was allowed to. So one Pharisee was like, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to take this broken piece of roof tile from my house, and I'm going to walk right to the end of where I'm allowed to walk. I'm going to dig a hole and bury that piece of roof tile, and now my house is here too. And so now I can walk another 2,000 paces. And they found maps, intricate maps of a Pharisee of a town. I don't even remember which town it is. And it shows where all the pieces of his house are buried around the city. He could go anywhere he wanted in the city and not ever get in trouble. It's like if somebody was like, hey, you're more than 2,000 paces from your home, you could be like, I've got a piece of roof tile right there, you know. And so when Jesus says, they say law, right? They use the word law. And Jesus is constantly saying, no, not law, traditions. And he never tells them that that they're not allowed to follow their own traditions. He never says that. What he always says is, you should have, it's like, okay, you're doing that. That's fine. But you shouldn't keep doing that, but don't neglect, he called it the weightier matters of the law, which was love and mercy and justice. Things of the heart, right? And that's what was important to Jesus. And so when he would come unglued on somebody, they'd be like, you broke the Sabbath law by plucking grains of wheat. And Jesus is like, I didn't break your law. I didn't break God's law. I broke your silly traditions. And I'm not going to be bound by your silly traditions. That's what Jesus was saying to them. And so, yeah, he calls them actors and says, these people honor me with their lips, but their hearts are far from me. Their worship is a farce. They teach man-made ideas as commands from God. And when I was, 21, maybe 22, somewhere in there, when I was 20, I got real serious about my faith, and I started going to church, and I started meeting every Wednesday with the preacher at that church. Very conservative church. The tradition I grew up in, we were very much about rules and saying you broke God's law when you hadn't broken God's law. You had broken one of our interpretations of God's law, right? And so he taught me all of the rules, not just the Bible, but our own, the Church of Christ's interpretations of those. And I got super involved in the church. I started working with the youth at the church, and I would take them, I kind of became their youth minister. And at one point, I had another friend that was a youth minister out in the desert, and so I went out there on a Sunday night so that the kids from my youth group could, hang out with the kids from his youth group, and we had play volleyball and have a bonfire and stuff like that. But before that, I'm sitting there in church listening to their preacher talk, and he was talking about this verse, and he was talking about how the Pharisees did these weird things with the pottery and how many paces you're allowed to go from your house, or like there's one law that says if your donkey falls in a pit on the Sabbath, you're not allowed to get a rope and tie it around it and pull it out. But if you have a belt that is strong enough, then you could use the belt to pull him out because you didn't go intending to do work, so you get a pass. And so this whole industry grew up in Judah and Samaria and on up towards Galilee of belts made out of rope. And so all these guys would have these belts that were made out of rope that if they ever needed it, they had it, And it became very much like the IRS tax code. It's like, I don't know if you've ever tried to do your own taxes. I used to do them when my taxes were very simple when I was a young man. As soon as I started having other stuff I'm like, I have no idea what's going on here. And we went and sat down with a guy who was a tax accountant now, but he had used to work for the IRS. And he'd be sitting there going, okay, you know, and he'd ask us questions about our money, our income. And he'd go, okay, yeah, legally you could claim this. That might raise a red flag if you claim that. So if I was you, I would claim a little bit less than that. This wouldn't cause a red flag. I'm like, yeah, that's right, because no, you don't want to get called in front of the IRS because that book is huge and you have no idea. And Jesus gets so mad because that's what the Pharisees have done to the Jewish people. That the Pharisees have all these loopholes that they just live their lives. It's no problem. But the regular people, they have no idea, and they're terrified constantly. You know, am I going to break the law and sin? Right? And they don't. It's like their heart is they don't want to break. They don't want to break God's law, and which infuriates Jesus because they're not breaking God's law. They're breaking these silly little traditions. So. In a lot of ways. The Pharisees could mess up. Mike just said that they were as afraid of the Pharisees as they were of the Romans. Somebody on Facebook said, hey, could you let us know what the question was? The Pharisees could mess up a Jew's day-to-day life much more than a Roman could. You know, I mean, a Roman could kill you, yeah, you know. But most of the time, you know, it's one of those things where it's like, yeah, the Romans were the oppressors. They were running things. You know, you kind of saw at the end of that clip from The Chosen where the centurion shows up, and when he does, they're all like, whoop, we're done. Yep, we're done. We're out of here, you know, because it's like nobody wants to get on their radar, you know. With the Pharisees, they could kick you out of the synagogue. And if you got kicked out of the synagogue, then no other Jew would sell you anything. No other Jew would buy you anything. You were shunned. You know, like, is it the Amish that do that? I think Mormons do that too, but I don't think it's quite as big a deal anymore because it's like, it used to be a big deal when Salt Lake City was nothing but conservative Mormons, but now it's grown to a point where it's like, well, then I'll just go over here to this guy's grocery store then or whatever. But the Amish, they're really, it's like if you get shunned, you have to leave the community. And so, yeah, they were much more afraid of the Pharisees than the Romans as far as that goes, as far as their day-to-day lives go. And so I heard the preacher talking about this, and then he read this about the whole man-made ideas as commands from God. And I'm like, that's exactly what we do at our church. Our biggest thing at our church was instrumental music. It had to be a cappella music. And what we would say is if you use an instrument in worship, you're going to hell. Now, I knew that. I grew up in this church where we never had an instrument in the building, right? When we sang, it was just voices, and I never knew why. And so the preacher then took me through why I was like, why? Why do we do that? And so he says, well, you know, because in the first century church, they didn't use instruments, which is true. They didn't really use instruments because it was based on synagogue worship. Synagogues didn't use instruments in their worship. They chanted with their voices. At the temple, they used instruments, but not at the synagogue. So when the Christians began meeting as the church, it's basically patterned after a synagogue service. So there are no instruments in the first century church, at least they're written about in the Bible. And he goes, and it says, I'm like, does it ever say, thou shalt not use instruments? No, doesn't say that. He says, but in Ephesians 5:24 and Colossians 3:26, two different places it says almost the same thing. Speak to one another with psalms, hymns, and spiritual songs, singing and making music in your heart to the Lord. He goes, you see it? I'm like, no. He's like, it doesn't say speak to one another with psalms, hymns, and spiritual songs, singing and making music with a harp or with a guitar or with a piano. It's with your heart to the Lord. That's what it says. So we're allowed to make music with our hearts, but not with anything else. And I was like, I didn't think about it then, but years later I thought, well, what about vocal cords? I mean, it doesn't say vocal cords, right? It says making music in your heart. And Zwingli, who was one of the reformers, like Calvin and Luther, he was in Switzerland, Zwingli was, he took that one verse so far to say, yeah, it doesn't say vocal cords, you can't sing out loud. And so in Zwingli's Reformed churches, you would open up your hymn books to song number 25 or whatever, and it would just be like, you know, and everybody would be singing along in their hearts, but there's no sound at all coming out. And so, I mean, it's like, that was our tradition, right? That was how I grew up. No, nothing wrong with deciding you wanted to sing just a cappella. But when I'm sitting there and I hear him say, they teach man-made ideas as commands from God, I'm like, oh, that's exactly what we do. We say, look, there's this verse that doesn't say anything about what we're talking about, but we have interpreted it through a bunch of spiritual gymnastics to mean you're going to hell if you do it. And I just was like stunned. It was like one of those like watershed moments for me. And I can remember I went back and I talked to the preacher about this, and he kept trying to like explain to me why that's not the
Cornelius, God has looked kindly on your sorrow and repentance. Send men to Joppa and find a man called Peter, who's staying with Simon a tanner near the sea.
Peter, these are looked upon as unclean. But do not call anything impure that God has cleansed.
There are 3 men downstairs. They have come for you. Go with them. Don't be afraid, because I have sent them.
Peter, there are men downstairs. Why are you smiling?